Okay, my name is John Mackay. For many years I was involved in education and particularly in science and then in geology, and it was a real issue when it came to the issue of the origin of life. It turned to be a quite controversial issue, and particularly when I developed courses that dealt with this issue, I discovered there was something more controversial than sex education, and that was to bring up the issue of where sex actually came from. Here's what we're going to do today. I'm going to, as Andrew said, give you a presentation, then enable you to have time to ask me any questions. I will bring your attention to one thing. As of last Friday, we have a new course on this subject, free, available online on our 3D Web Museum, which just went up last Friday. And if you want to know how to find it, as I told Richard Dawkins last night, it's there, it's up. It's a 15-part course called The Search for the Origin of Life, and it's based on all the textbooks that are commonly used in your high schools here in the UK, dealing with where life actually comes from. Did you catch that back in October, I got off the plane and they handed me a newspaper cutting from the Daily Telegraph the 1st of October, headed "Creationism Can Be a Topic in Class." And it gives a report that the minister has ruled that science teachers can talk about creationism in the classroom, provided they make the proviso, they point out that it has no scientific support. Interesting ruling. Last night I was interviewed by Richard Dawkins. Obviously, people who have a creationist perspective must be getting enough profile for Richard to even worry about interviewing people like me. The fact that the minister would make a statement means that it's an issue out there which has been ignored, but obviously is no longer being ignored. It's quite humorous. I often get invited into schools to talk about this issue and discover that the reason I've been invited into the schools is not because of Christian theologians, but because there might be a majority of Muslims in the class, and they have a very strong creation view. Of course, there's those Christians that do as well, but they don't usually tend to speak up as much as some of the strongly voiced Muslims. This is what we're going to deal with today. The subject of creation, a bit of background. Craig Hawkins has a master's degree in science. He's joined Creation Research a little while ago, and he and I were asked to do a debate against two of Australia's leading atheist scientists. Obviously they were evolutionists, and Craig, who makes no bones about being a Christian who's involved in science, has a strong stand on creation. The newspapers heard about it, they promoted it, and the end result was the auditorium was packed. Overflow video leads into extra rooms, etc. I enjoyed the debate, and look how the report appeared the next day in the newspapers. Sadly, it was the creationists who came out the clear winners. I thought, what an interesting way to comment on the evolutionary atheists losing the debate. Why would someone be sad that creationists have won the debate? Well, Craig and I were asked just a couple of months ago to do a debate in the philosophy department, chaired by the Professor of Philosophy at Monash at Melbourne University, and here is the introductory entrance to the university. The evolution starts here. Obviously, they very publicly announce where that department stands. You live in a world in which you can listen to David Attenborough every week on the BBC and discover that he is firmly convinced that absolutely everything evolved, and his basic argument is there really can't be a God, because how come there's a little boy in Africa with a worm that crawls into its eyeball? What sort of a God would make a world like that? Well, if you want to follow up any of these debates, because it's not quite a debate this morning, I got the front and you've got question time, but they're all on DVD, and you'll notice up there on the free table there's samples of the DVD debates, and we'd encourage you to make use of them, and they're available also after we leave here on that website there. If you kept up with us last year, we were the flavour of the month here in the UK. Amazing. Times Educational Supplement, Guardian Educational Supplement, Six Day Wonder. Not a bad picture of me, by the way. But here's the one that intrigued me. Why on earth would the Financial Times pay a reporter to follow me around for a month? Invasion of privacy, Big Brother. It was an interesting time. Well, I guess the end result is that whether we like it or not, our policies on accounting actually are related to whether we think there's a higher authority who will hold us finally accountable. Otherwise, you get away with what you want. There's actually moral issues associated with issues on the origin of life. Even in my own country in Australia, look at the Sydney Sun Herald. Darwin's evolutionary theory is a tottering nonsense built on too many suppositions. That's actually meant to be me there at the bottom, dressed as Moses on Mount Sinai. Well, I didn't really care how they portrayed me. I really did say that at the top. It's an accurate quote. And you know how newspapers work, don't you? I'll guarantee most people didn't read the rest of that, but it was too late. They'd got the headlines. But here's a good question. Why such a fuss? There's Charles Darwin's robot in the St. Louis Museum explaining his theory. You know, the theory of evolution, that molecules evolved into living creatures over vast periods of time due to the natural properties of the universe. They turned into us. Why such a fuss? Well, look what Charles Darwin's great-great-grandson said, quoted in the Sunday Times back in November 2000. "I don't believe in God. How could I, given my great-great-grandfather's theories? But perhaps I'd feel happier if I did. Just because I've rejected conventional religion, it does not mean there isn't a void to be filled." Now, obviously, he's making an association between the theory of evolution and rejecting God. But in this context, is he talking about the religion of Buddhism? No, he's an Englishman. Is he talking about Hinduism? No. In this context, he's referring exclusively to Christianity. Why such a connection? Well, have a look at this. Charles Darwin. It's interesting to watch his views change as he writes his first book and his second book and his third book. By the time he got towards the end, look what he says. "I'd gradually come by this time to see that the Old Testament, with its manifestly false history of the world." I have to smile. I often get asked to debate theologians here. There's a debate over there, myself versus the Reverend Dr. Sir John Polkinghorne in Liverpool Cathedral, who would probably be England's leading theistic evolutionist. I love reminding people that Charles Darwin had a master's degree in theology. And if you try and put the biblical God together with his theory, Darwin would have been the first person to disagree with you. Because Darwin's conclusion was, if I'm right, then the Old Testament is not just in error, it's manifestly false. How does this show up in controversy? Well, here's a book. Do you see the name of the author? It's really Dr. Gary Parker. I came across this man many years ago when I was a student. I'm one of these guys that, I trained in geology. I soon discovered we were the undertakers of the world. So I decided to do 3 years of genetics and find out how living things work, not just dead fossils. And in third year genetics at Queensland University, we used a textbook by Dr. Gary Parker. Two things were evident. One, he was an atheist. Two, he really did believe he was a monkey's uncle. He was firmly convinced of evolution. Next time I met him, he was the author of this book. You can see, by the way, he's no longer an evolutionist. Well, he was no longer an atheist either. He was a Christian and still a biology professor. Interesting thing, though, they don't use his textbooks at Queensland University anymore. There's a real prejudice in this particular issue. In fact, if you're wondering why not, look how it shows up. You remember the minister's statement? Teachers can refer in science classes to the issue of creationism, provided they say it's got no scientific support. I'm very happy with that ruling, by the way, because there's how most science teachers think science works. Scientists refrain from considering God's actions in their work. Da-da-da-da-da-da. Most science teachers don't even know what a heuristic method is, but we'll leave it in there. But look at the bit I've got outlined in yellow. Scientific theories are therefore explanations about aspects of nature without reference to God. which, by the way, philosophically is a reference to God. You can't avoid it. But what it just said, and it's something in education you really do need to take seriously, any explanation is accepted in a science classroom provided it is atheistic or agnostic. That's really what that statement says. We don't like to go there because scientists like to claim to be objective. But the minute you say, I can't accept an explanation, even if it was true, if God's involved, then all of a sudden you've declared your religion. And in fact, you're wondering why there's controversy. This atheist, quite a few years ago now, made a very profound statement about this connection. Look what he said. Christianity has fought, still fights, and will fight science to the desperate end over evolution. Because evolution destroys utterly and finally the very reason Jesus' earthly life was supposedly made necessary. He went on to say this. By the way, his point here is exactly the point I kept making at Liverpool Cathedral to Dr. John Polkinghorne, Cambridge University, PhD in theology. The evolutionary atheist got it really right. Destroy Adam and Eve and the original sin, and in the rubble you'll find the sorry remains of the Son of God. If Jesus was not the Redeemer who died for our sins, and this is what evolution means, then Christianity is nothing. Last night when I was being interviewed for a Channel 4 program with Richard Dawkins, he agreed totally with that statement. His perspective is an atheist. He's well known for it, right? And I kept hammering, Richard, don't tell me you're an objective scientist. Tell me you're an atheist scientist, right? Then everybody knows where you're coming from. What's the connection? Give you a little more authority. You see, Christianity is associated with the name Jesus Christ. There's what he said to his disciples, recorded in John's Gospel, chapter 5. If you believe Moses, you'd believe me. Let me quote from Moses. Isn't it true that they portrayed me as Moses on the top of Mount Sinai? That's what I was dressed up as. On the top of Mount Sinai, Moses, the Bible records, is given 2 tablets with 10 what on them? Commandments. Okay, one of those commandments says, in 6 days God made the heavens and the earth and the seas and everything that's in them. Fascinating. You don't believe Moses, Jesus said, you won't believe me. Now, our subject this morning is not theology, but it's the importance of this and some of the data that's associated with asking a question about creation. Remember we said we just posted a new course, 15-part course for high schoolers called The Search for the Origin of Life on our website, and that basically deals with, okay, if creation is true, how would you recognize it if you fell over it? Or if life evolved, how would you recognize the evidence? And as I keep repeating to people, in education, our primary task is to teach students how to think, not what to think. Because if they can't think, they'll never decide what this is right or what that is wrong or why they would even think about it. Okay, part 2 of our little talk today. Back to Charles Darwin. I've already reminded you that Charles Darwin graduated with a master's degree in theology. We need to keep that in mind, because if you're Charles Darwin and you're doing a master's degree in theology in the 1800s, before somebody called Charles Darwin's views of evolution were popular, you studied this book at university. When you have a look, when Mr. Bill Gates agrees with me here to turn this a bit further on, when you look, if you're studying theology in the 1800s, you study the book of Genesis. There's what Genesis says about the origin of things. It didn't happen by itself. If you look at most textbooks today, the impression you get is the world did happen by itself. Time, matter, energy is all you need. But then don't be surprised, science has any explanation without reference to God, whether it's true or not. God created things after their own kind. And you go on a little bit further and you discover that Genesis says God made everything very good. Why am I telling you this? Because Darwin was one of the first to figure out, if that's true, what would disprove it? If it's false, what would the evidence be? Because he knew what it said. He knew exactly what he was out to prove or disprove. He was quite a reasonable thinker and quite a reasonable researcher. His theory basically says things have not produced their own kind because hydrogen turning into people is a fair degree of change. But you have to put it in context. He knew what he was out to prove because he knew what he was out to disprove. Genesis chapter 1 says 10 times that God made things to produce their own kind. Okay, if that's true, and if this is true, the world has changed, but it's actually degenerated. It hasn't evolved because there's the big picture of evolution. Oh, I know things can degenerate if they've evolved, but basically you have to get from hydrogen up to people somehow. And that's a fair degree of not producing your own kind. I love it when I go into schools to challenge them and ask them, what was the proof of evolution? What evidence do you accept and why? Let's think about it. Let's take a modern textbook, college textbook, 2006, because that's when I originally prepared this part of the talk. Their evidence for evolution, they give us the historical bit. Darwin, 1859. See the course of his ship, the Beagle? Landed on the Galapagos Islands. There he noticed that finches have different shaped beaks. And the textbooks almost invariably begin Darwin and natural selection with these finches. His conclusion, finches from South America gave 8 species of finches on the Galapagos. Why would he say that? Why do we need to bring up the issue of creation? Well, the reality is it's almost impossible to follow Darwin's logic unless you know where he's actually come from. The Galapagos Islands are volcanic. In Darwin's mind, there were no volcanoes in a good world. He's a theologian. Okay, if there's no volcanoes originally, then this has to post-date creation. So these finches on the Galapagos can't have been created there because the volcanoes are new. So the nearest finches are in South America. So in South America, they don't look quite the same. So the only possible explanation is finches from South America somehow flew or blew across to the Galapagos, and there, due to natural selection, sexual selection, they evolved into 8 different species. He even wrote a book about it. I mean, that's the famous text, isn't it? On the origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favoured races in the struggle for life. The common catchphrases, survival of the fittest, nature red in tooth or claw, kill or be killed. That's the normal concepts that are coming in. But there's where Steve Jones and Richard Dawkins go with it. Finches from South America gave 8 species of finches on the Galapagos, therefore single cells evolved into people, because that's the next leap that most textbooks make. And if we wanted to credit Darwin with anything, he's actually given us that set of glasses. Whether we like it or not, if we come up through the modern education system, we leave with a set of glasses through which we see the world. Number one, we define evolution as change. Secondly, we start to call all change evolution. Just do a Google hunt on the word evolution in 1995, 1993, 1800. See how the word has come up simply to mean change. Then you accept any change as proof of evolution, but by this time you're talking about hydrogen turning into lecturers, and dismiss creation as unthinkable. You see, when Darwin wrote his first book, The Origin of Species, creator is still mentioned in the text. By the time you get to the end of his life, his creator has gotten smaller and smaller and is now out of the window, and his great-great-grandson says he actually couldn't believe in any God at all. But did you know that? Darwin assumed what he meant by species was the same as the biblical word kind. You want to know the background? Did they tell you at school that the guy who invented our classification system was an evangelical Lutheran creationist? And if not, why not? You see, because Carl von Linné believed in special creation. So the concept of species is a very useful one. Why is Carl von Linné famous? because he solved a problem that people have been trying to solve for the last 2,000 provable years. The ancient Greeks tried to come up with a classification system which would label animals and plants correctly. They never solved it. Carl von Linné did, with the simple assumption Genesis is right, God created, they've been made separate kinds, so like books in a library, they have books in common, but some of them will be detective stories, some of them will be dictionaries, so you can classify them according to their similarities and their differences, and they should be in neat little bundles. For the first time, it worked. Okay, Darwin assumes that what he meant by species, if I can prove that species 1 has turned into species 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6, therefore species originally were not created. Interesting. Did you realise that there are other factors involved? I found this hard to come to grips with, that Science actually published this. It's a review of Charles Darwin's life by his great-great-grandson Randall. Published in Science not too long ago. After Annie's death, he writes, Charles Darwin set the Christian faith firmly behind him. Freed from the last vestige of belief that the world was perfect because God created that way, Darwin continued without spiritual restraint to work out his theory on the origin of the species. Now, I'll be honest, as an educator, every student should know that, because they should know what motivates me, or I'm not telling them the truth. I never make any bones about hiding from the fact that I'm a Christian, and this influences how I think about the environment, how I think about the world. And here's why. That influenced Charles Darwin. The BBC had a program on Darwin's life, and you might remember he sat outside every Sunday on his daughter's tombstone while the rest of the family went to church. Up until then, he'd gone to church. What was his problem? How could there be a good God if he let my innocent little girl die? Good question. His answer in the end, there is no good God. He rejects Christianity. That's a real motivating force. In fact, I have a suspicion that we should retitle his book that. My Revenge. I wonder how you would decide things like this. Do you realise philosophical motivation in science is incredibly important? Why do we believe in a universe, not a diverse or a triverse? Answer, Isaac Newton picked up his Bible. How many gods did he read about? One. And God was a God of law and order. One God, one set of laws. Word for law, verse. Word for one, uni. We have a universe because it's a philosophical concept, not because we've been to the end to prove the same laws go all the way through it. And every student should know that. Well, they should know about Charles Darwin's philosophical situation too. And what they should do is be able to check facts. Okay, let's check some Finch facts. There's an amazing amount of research money out there, and people can sometimes sit around and watch what finches do on the Galapagos Islands, and they actually interbreed. All of those so-called separate species of finches have babies that are fertile. The relevance? Remember the old farmer's rule? If you cross a horse and a donkey, you get a mule. The mule is sterile, evidence that horses and donkeys are different species. It's a pragmatic rule of thumb, but in the case of Charles Darwin, if you ask the question, if the 8 different species, or 14 according to the current classifiers, can all interbreed and they all have fertile offspring and their offspring have beaks that are halfway between one and the other, how many species are there? You see, when I've got a big crowd in front of me, I love to point out to them that I'm looking at people who have different shaped beaks. And they can all interbreed and they all have fertile offspring, and there's only really one species. In fact, you know what else has happened? Since 1967, they've taken finches and they put them in different locations around the world. And when they fly out to all the islands in archipelago, their beak shapes change. In fact, we now know what's happened. They, like you, have hormone detector kits. You have them in your feet. You take your shoes off when you come to Australia. Firstly, it's murder. You feel all the pain from the pebbles, but then your body deliberately grows more skin. And after a little while, you can't feel the stones. Then you come back to England, you take your shoes off, your body detects. You don't need protection anymore, so it thins out your feet. And in the bath, you'll see the skin peeling off. Well, it turns out the finches actually have a little hormone detector kit. And if the babies grow up with hard food, their beak changes shape. And if you then take them back to another island and they grow up on soft food, you'll find their beak changes shape. There's a picture most people have never seen, South American finches. There's the Galapagos finches. Okay, we've been watching these now since Darwin's day. That's 170 years ago. What have we observed? Now, observation is what science and real useful information is based on. For 170 years, we have observed the fact that finches with beaks have produced finches with beaks. So, what is it evidence for? I love to remind my students when I'm out in the schools like we were yesterday, not too far from here in Brentwood, if we've observed finches from South America, did we observe them give 8 species of finches on the Galapagos? No, we actually didn't observe that. Everywhere we've observed them, we've observed finches with beaks give finches with beaks, and they can actually change the shape of their beak size. But let's assume that's a valid statement, that we know that the finches from South America did give 8 species of finch in 170 years, or even longer. Is that an invalid conclusion? All we can really prove is that finches have turned into finches. Question, is that a contradiction of the biblical statement that God created things to produce their own kind? I don't think so. And every student's entitled to know that. In fact, why teach creation? Because there's quite a large amount of science which is incomprehensible if you don't remind them where science actually came from. Let's give you an example. Dr. Steve Jones, Royal Society lecture last year. His topic, why creationism is wrong and evolution is right. Why would dear Steve Jones have to give a lecture with such a title? Obviously, people like me must be beginning to be heard and felt in places, otherwise we'd be ignored. He says the finest evidence of evolution comes from the fossils. I debated Dr. Michael Caldwell, University in Canada. The fossil record serves as a historical test of change over time. All right, last year I got off the plane at Heathrow, and in the newspaper was an article on snake hips. Okay, I thought that's interesting. But, you know, this is just the Guardian and the Telegraph. So I picked up the Times to see what their report was, and they have a picture of the actual fossil, and they have information in there. It says the fossil of a snake with hips found in South America, it's called Najash rheogrena, which takes its name from the leg snake described in the Bible. And then they tell you the discovery was reported in the journal Nature in April 2006. Now, Nature, by the way, is the world's oldest and most prestigious scientific journal. If you get your work in Nature, you are there, right? It's really, really prestigious. All right, do you see what the statement is there? Najash rheogrena takes its name from the leg snake described in the Bible. Najash rheogrena is our classification system, genus and species. Species and genus come from a creationist who realized that if creation was true, you could have a naming system. But how do I explain this to kids unless I can open up Genesis and tell them where the scientists got their idea from? Let's do it. There's what Genesis says. Obviously, there's enough scientists who know that who would say, well, we can use this name for our new discovery of a snake with hips. Genesis 3 says, the Lord God told the serpent it would go on its belly and eat dust all the days in its life. And if you've ever talked to a Sunday school kid, the first impression they get after the teacher does this lesson is the snake used to walk, the reptile used to walk, the serpent used to walk, and somehow it lost its legs. That's the childlike concept you get just at first face value. Obviously, the scientists who named this creature had that perspective too. All right, Dr. Michael Caldwell is an expert on fossil snakes. The fossil record serves as a test of change over time. I think that's an accurate statement. But let's have a look. Meet one of his most famous discoveries, Pachyrhecus problematicus. Latin, by the way, for what the heck is it? But in reality, it turns out to be a creature that is a snake with legs. It's not the only one. Here's a second one. Oh, look at these fancy names. Hasiopsis pterosanctus. Supposed to be 95 million years old. And look, they've even given you a nice little diagram of some of the legs. Now, if you're wearing Charles Darwin's glasses, mostly used by people like David Attenborough and Steve Jones to see everything, you will automatically slot that change as evidence of evolution. Because you see, if snakes used to have legs and now they don't, that's a change. But is it actually what Charles Darwin's theory or any modern version of evolution is really on about? Because the end result that most people in England do is reject creation as completely unthinkable. Let's take the dates as valid. And I'll be honest, I don't regard those dates as anything more than theory, because this grey hair qualifies me to have seen the rocks that my house is built on change age 3 times. Right? So they're not facts, they're just the latest theory of the guy who's got his PhD at the top of the pile. But let's use them. For 95 million supposed years, we have now established snakes have become snakes and they've lost their legs. Okay, we haven't explained where snakes come from, we've just observed them lose things. Steve Jones accuses me of inventing the word devolve, but you find it's actually been in our literature a long time. It means to go downhill. You have the evolution of things and you have the devolution, you know, in politics, right? England's devolving power at the moment. You've got Scottish government, Welsh government. The word's been around for a long time. They have devolved and they've actually produced their own kind. Has it happened many times? Well, look. Here's our friend Dr. Michael Caldwell again. We've now got 50 groups of creatures that we've dug up in the rocks, either reptiles or amphibians, and we can prove they used to have legs, and now they don't. Now, do you remember when the scientists in one company got into lots of trouble because they invented a drug called thalidomide? And women took it. It did a good job. It stopped you feeling sick in the morning, but it did a bad thing as well. Do you remember what it did? The kids were born without arms or legs. Nobody said, Johnny's evolving. Because if you said that, you wouldn't have been able to sue the drug company. This was a devolution. It was a loss. It was a degeneration. In fact, you can watch it happening. It is interesting to note that of all the animal groups on the planet, reptiles have the biggest tendency to lose limbs, even in the present day. You can watch it happening. Here's a creature that crawled across my front porch. Do you see its cute little legs? They're basically useless. Oh, it can still squiggle along, but it doesn't do that as fast as it could run along, because you can put its brothers that have still got legs alongside it, and the ones with legs do real good. So this creature has to hide most of the time because he can't get away from you. But look, there was an article on these legless lizards in our version of National Geographic, Australian Geographic. In legless lizards, there is a bulge above the eyes, and unlike snakes, they have ears. The term legless lizard is in fact a misnomer. They have hind legs, but evolution has reduced these to nothing more than scale flaps. That's what they did. Evolution is change. Any change is proof of evolution, and the end result, whether we like it or not, is most people then automatically say reptiles weren't created. That's the view that Darwin has imposed upon us, and most of us don't even think about it. Okay, let's just finish this section off here. I have that question a few times. Last night, I was pleased to be interviewed for Channel 4 by Richard Dawkins. I don't know how much of the interview will survive. The program's not due to release till next year in association with it coming up to Darwin's birthday. But I did remind Richard about his statement on PBS, and he really hasn't changed his mind since then. He's asked by Bill Moyers, is evolution a theory, not a fact? Dawkins replies with his usual enthusiastic dogmatism, evolution has been observed. But then he said something which I had to say, did you really say that? It's just that it hasn't been observed while it's been happening. So I asked him again last night. I reminded him that one reason I abandoned evolution as a fact was I was sitting in a third-year genetics class when a student put his hand up and said, "But Professor Mather, if evolution is true, how come you can't see it happening?" And the professor said, "Well, it takes so long to happen, you wouldn't expect to see it happen." And then Richard Dawkins interrupted and said, "But yes, it is a long, slow process." So it hasn't been observed. And we're teaching students in science that science is based on what has been observed. Okay, if we haven't observed it, then we shouldn't be teaching it as fact. Teach it as an interpretation if you like, but on that basis, you need to admit this. Change is true, but evolution is actually not what we observe to be true in any Darwinian or Richard Dawkins or Steve Jones sense at all. Okay, last thought for the morning. Then we'll throw it open to you for questions. Why teach creation? Remember my question there about Darwin? Why such a fuss? Well, you're involved in politics. You have a lot of issues: stem cell research, cloning, environment, man, our relationship to each other, local peace, international peace, settling disputes. How do you decide it? Because here's what most people see as the logical, philosophical and moral extension, as does Richard Dawkins, as does Charles Darwin's great-great-grandson. If that's the real history of man, chimpanzees on the left-hand side, yours truly on the right-hand side, right? If that's the sort of picture you have, then you have to ask questions like, okay, is abortion murder or is it just convenience? If we're running out of chimps, do we pass laws to protect them? And if we have too many people, do we get rid of them? You see, all of those issues will be decided on, did God make man in his image so man is different, and therefore we're accountable to God for how we treat our fellow man? Or do we take Stalin's perspective that it's the survival of the species that matters, so it doesn't matter how many Russians we kill off? Because that really was his modus operandi in justifying what he did under his communist atheistic mentality. Most of the moral issues you will discover will ultimately get back to, how did we get here? Is sex something which just happened? Because if it is, males evolved, females evolved, what's wrong with a third option, homosexuality? I get myself into lots of trouble when I remind them that the traditional Christian explanation is very simple. God made Adam and Eve, end of argument. He didn't make Adam and Bruce. So standard Christian morality has always been for a husband and wife in marriage without exceptions. And it's based on creation. Abandon creation and that argument looks ridiculous. Right? So when you have a look at the issues that you folks have to decide in political rules, in education rules, you can't just treat science as if it is amoral, because it isn't. It's something which is part of the whole of morality. I love to remind people that there's no such distinction between science and religion at all. The only choice a scientist has is which religion he associates with his science, because most of our modern science actually grew out of men who had a firm Christian commitment, a mentality of Christianity. Easy to prove, let me show it to you. If I want to be a scientist, I have to believe the world is real. I have to believe I'm real. I have to believe I'm real and rational. And I have to believe that for every real and rational question, there's a real and rational answer. If I grew up as a Buddhist, and I think that cow over there is great-grandma recycled 14 times, I will not ask serious questions about cows. In fact, if I think that reality is somewhere else, I will not even be concerned socially about what's around me. Where would we get beliefs that the world is real? Finally, you will discover why there's a connection between largely Christian theology and many of the subjects in science. Did they tell you at school that the word geology was invented by the Bishop of Durham? Didn't tell me either. It took me a lot of finding out, but you can even find it on the Durham website. They're proud of it. But theology and science actually really do go hand in hand. I believe that man is rational, not because you can prove it. You only got to study psychology at the university, so you can't prove that. I believe it because the biblical account says we're made in God's image. That's why Newton believed it. And therefore we are real, we are rational, and God has made a world in which he told us You will love me with your mind. You will think. Change all that, and don't be surprised if in this country you have to publish reports that say, well, what is happening to the average sexual health in Great Britain? It's doing that. And the reason is we think we're just animals. And if we are just animals, why not behave that way? Science does have moral overtones, and morality has got a right to influence what we do in science, and you'll find the only common connector that really works happens to be this connection. If you're wondering why we've rejected Christian morality, it's to do with Jesus and Moses. There is a real link. You see, if you accept Moses, isn't there a law about adultery? Isn't there a law about faithfulness in marriage? You bring that in and all of a sudden you have very few problems with sexual transmission of diseases because it doesn't happen in the first place. You believe Moses said, Jesus, you believe me, reject Moses, and you will reject me. I'm willing to make a prediction that the ascent of evolution has reached its peak. There's enough people like me and people in professional science who've really started to make a dent in the whole issue. Hence Steve Jones has to entitle talks for the Royal Society on creationism being wrong. He wouldn't need to do that if he wasn't concerned about the influence that people like I and many others are having. Particularly as I was really thrilled yesterday when one of your high schools, we spoke to their 11s, 12s and 13 grades and then got publicly welcomed back the next time we're around. It is really becoming an influence which I'd encourage you to find out about. Okay, I'm going to leave that up there. Time for you to ask me questions over the next 20 minutes or whatever our time left that we have.
Hi. We live in a multicultural society, and there's even talk about faith schools. There are some faith schools, holy Muslim schools and stuff. How can you justify teaching creationism as part of the curriculum and not teaching every faith and what every faith believes? I mean,
okay.
how can we
You will
bring
find that I'm not talking about teaching the faith, right? But you will also find that you can't have a view in science which doesn't impinge on what people have as faiths. So when I go to a university, it's quite interesting to note that there's usually quite a few Muslims in the audience now who are quite happy with the issue of creation. And they're quite unhappy with their students being taught that they've evolved, right? So don't be surprised that increasingly they will set up their own schools and they will reject the curriculum. You know how strongly they feel about things, right? In this country, you may have read yesterday's report that increasingly your private education system is taking over the number of spaces in universities. Right? We may or may not like that, but it's happening because many people are willing now to withdraw from the public education system. And speaking as an educator, my observation is if you teach kids we are animals, the long-term problems you have in behaviour are one reason you'll lose support from parents in the end, and that's one thing that's actually happening. In terms of the issue of origin of life, there is a subject called science, and you wouldn't start it by saying we're now going to read from the Quran Surah 52 or we're now going to read in Genesis or whatever.
Creationism is the Christian version.
You will actually discover that's a falsehood, right? It's commonly perceived, but if I take Australia, for example, there was a government policy to sort of demissionify the Aboriginal reserves, so the first thing they did was send university graduates out to teach the Aborigines. And in one particular case it was quite funny because the young man who was sent out was quite an ardent evolutionist. And it wasn't long before the government got complaints, we do not want this man teaching our children we come from monkeys, right? Because the traditional Aboriginal view is the Great Spirit made us. Right, so you will actually discover you can draw a line in the sand, and on this side there's 99.9% of all traditional beliefs which have creation and Noah's flood in them. I was in a school a little while ago and somebody asked me the same question quite a lot more aggressively than you are because they were fairly antagonistic. But I said, look, let's universify this. Let's give you, take the Vedas, for example, and ask a question, why do we call ourselves human beings? The answer is not in English, it's in Sanskrit. And if you pick up your Vedas, you'll discover in the Vedas there's a story. And the story goes, only Manu and his 7 spiritual helpers survived the big flood. Okay, and everybody in the world is descended from Manu. And the story tells you that we are his descendants, and then you trace the story all through Europe, because English and Sanskrit are related like that.
So there might be some crossovers.
Okay, but no,
between...
let's just let me finish off. You will find that by the time it gets into English, the old way of saying it was we are the CYN of Manus, but English are famous for chopping words, swapping them over. Now we call ourselves mankind, which really means the descendants of the person who survived the big flood. And you know a story about a big flood. The Aborigines in Australia got the same story. So you will discover that the concept that this is exclusively a Christian Genesis thing is simply fallacious. If I'm going to deal with evidence in anthropology about where people come from, how come I'm not allowed to tell them the Aboriginal version of Noah's flood? I can't deal with evidence if I'm not. If my hands are tied and says I can only talk about evolution, then I've got to insult the Aborigines because they've got a different story.
But in teaching it, would you quote Genesis?
Certainly I would.
So
and same as I'd quote the Aboriginal stories, right? Yeah, I would. No doubt about it. Because that's where we get our concepts in science, like species and everything, from. That's why they use the name for the snake. I can't make sense of it without that. Anybody else?
Thank you very much. You made a distinction between theories and facts, as if there are certain things called scientific facts, and there are other things that are, as it were, just theories. Whereas science actually consists in theories that have been tested and that have been found to have evidence to support them. And the best example of that is Newtonian mechanics, which for 250 years was thought to be a theory so strongly supported by the evidence that it was seen by most people to be unassailable fact until the theory of relativity came along, showing that, which was then tested and was then shown to actually supersede Newton, encompassing all of what Newton said, but explaining more as well. Particularly that light is bent by gravity. I suppose then my question to you is, what testable predictions does your theory produce? I suppose that's my question.
Okay, good. I'll go in 2 directions, because there's one aspect which most of us never think through in that regard. And if you can look up the New York Times website, Paul Davies, quite a noted physicist, actually had a very insightful article on the nature of science and this problem in particular, because some things that we hold as absolute facts, right, 200 years later may turn out not to be facts, just a way of seeing things. And his article deals with, okay, now we've discovered that even the basics of physics and chemistry is nowhere near as factual as we thought it was. And his bottom line is, how can you then argue this against religion? Because if science turns out to not be as factually based as we thought, then the conflict, it just is really abstract. It's philosophy only. Okay, so there's the first point. So whenever we use the theory of evolution to argue against Christianity, we have made a very serious error in philosophical logic. You simply shouldn't even be able to go in that direction. And that's really the point that Paul Davies is making, that science by its nature is never at a stage where it could contradict what you're saying over here in your religious statement. Secondly, you will discover that when you ask about predictions, science works best when it says, if this is true, I can make a prediction about this happening in 2 years' time. Okay, and then you hang around for 2 years and it will happen. If you make that sort of successful prediction, your fame is assured for quite a long time. In the nature of this subject here, when you try and step backwards, it's much harder. So the first thing I like to point out with students, or even geologists, I dig up a dinosaur bone on our dinosaur digs in Montana. It doesn't come up with a label that says, hi, I was here 200 million years ago. It was in the hole on the day I dug it. Now I start to tell you a story about where it was a long time ago that I can't get back into. Point number one, that's not science. It's not even history. It's maybe an educated guess, which will be subject to my assumptions and things like that. So when science tries to deal with the past, it has much more severe limitations. But your question is about predictions, and that's where science really does come up best. Here's my predictions. I'll just give you a couple to illustrate this. When you look at the biblical picture of creation, undeniably it's got a background of association with science, but we have been, since we've become agnostic or atheistic evolutionists, trying to make life in test tubes. Our bottom line, read the whole of a modern biology textbook. It usually starts with Miller's amino acid experiment, in which we're trying to get chemicals to naturally combine into substances which could be life properties, right? So far we haven't got very far. And our basic problem, I predict, is this. We assume that life is the natural result of the properties of the universe, no God needed, no outside help needed. So carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, and whatever physical properties exist in the universe are sufficient to explain where life came from. So far, nobody has managed to make anything living at all by a naturalistic process. We've cheated a bit. We invent test tubes. We choose our chemicals carefully. Unknowingly, we are adding intelligent design. We don't like to admit it, but we are playing God. Here's my prediction. If we want to make life in a test tube, we will have to use not the evolutionist formula, which is matter plus time plus energy gives life. The real formula will be matter plus time plus energy plus outside information. Information that does not come from the properties of matter. And my specific example, remember I put up our course site, I'll put it up again because this is outlined in detail for the high schoolers. One of the things we like to point out is that you need to be able to recognise the evidence of a creation. And it's not as hard as people think, because a creation, as my colleague I debated from Harvard University, Dr. Krista Karlas, said, a creation is anything that can't happen by itself. That's a really good basic definition. Here's something that can't happen by itself. Aluminium and felt does not do lectins. So this is evidence of somebody who existed before it, somebody who's not a part of it, somebody who's smarter than it. All right? You might want more technical definitions. That's easy. The elements that are in here do not possess the properties of doing this, so the end product has more information than the starting product. And the information did not come from the aluminium or the plastic. When you have a think about that, apply it to life. Our basic life code is DNA. If we could figure out how to make DNA do what we want it, then we could probably fix up diabetes. That's the sort of research we're trying to do. But here's what we're discovering. Carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, oxygen, all the things, the elements that make up DNA, do not possess one property called coding. None of those things actually make codes. In fact, the codes in DNA turn out to be as artificial as the codes in my computer. If you've ever wondered why Bill Gates has made millions, he's taken zeros and ones and he's put them intelligently together in an order that zeros and ones don't possess, and he's sold it to you. He paid nothing for zeros and ones. You pay £400 for the latest Windows project. He's made a big profit, right? So he's selling you information. He's not selling you zeros and ones. And the information has come from outside. So when it comes to making DNA or making life, the formula will be matter plus time plus information plus intelligence, or us playing God. That is the only way it will work. So there is an easy prediction to make. The second one...
Could I just, before you go any further,
Yep.
the prediction you're making is that life will be made,
Yep.
and that it will be made using
Intelligence.
energy, the elements,
Yeah.
and so on, plus intelligence,
Yes.
and that this is testable.
Yes.
So you're saying that at some point it's quite possible that life will be made,
Yes.
and when do you think this will be?
Well, so far it's not around the corner, I can tell you that, but it is being worked on. Right? There's a paper just out 2 weeks ago on making life by the guy Werner, who worked on the genetic code. Because once you've discovered how the code works, then you can invent your own. Right? But you are doing it by applying intelligence. So whether it's 10 years or whatever, so far we've spent 100 years trying to manufacture life, and all of our naturalistic processes have simply not worked. But there is one other factor which is a bit easier to test. You see, Genesis, and it refers to time in the past. I wasn't there, so I can't step back to check the beginning, but Darwin wasn't there, so he can't step back into his either. Either way, the scientist with this issue has to admit he has a faith starting point, and no scientist should ever run away from that. Faith is most of our life, because I don't know everything, you don't know everything, right? So we all have a faith parameter, and we've got to be open about it. But here's a testable consequence. If it is true that God created things to produce their own kind, then they are designed to not evolve. So there has to be a mechanism in your body which actually prevents you doing anything else but producing your own kind. And in this course, if you go and have a look at it, Dr. Diane Eager, who was a lecturer at Canberra University for many years in medical biology, is responsible for the section on DNA repair. Because one of the things that is really fascinating is that your DNA is designed to stop itself evolving or even devolving. It has maintenance mechanisms for repair which are unbelievably sophisticated. And that's the sort of thing evolution would not produce naturally, because evolution is a process of change. There's no need for it to have a process to evolve a repair kit which is so sophisticated it actually stops you evolving. And that's the sort of things we are really beginning to find out. Okay, so there are testable consequences. All right, anyone else got any questions before we sort of begin to fold the morning down? They want us out of here at 9-ish, 9:30 or something like that. Yeah?
Is it true that, say, the pellucida, which is a barrier around the recipient egg, would stop evolution because it stops penetration from male to female of different species? Said to actually stop evolution?
Well, you know, the latest, the sort of controversy in cloning where we're trying to take animal bits and mix them with human bits, there are lots of barriers that pop up. It's not just simply the construction of the lining on the egg or the womb or anything, right? There's lots of things that so far we haven't mastered, and I honestly don't think we should go in that direction, right? But even when, like as I said, I took several years of genetics to try and figure out these things, and the simplest sort of changes will actually prevent mating. The simplest one I ever saw was where you get radiation come into the cell and the chromosome splits, right? And it's got a self-repair mechanism, because immediately you can see coming out of the ends there's sticky stuff. And when it bumps into another, the broken end, it will immediately re-glue, all right? Sometimes, however, the currents in the cell have flipped it over, so it re-glues backwards. So instead of reading A, B, C, D, E, F, G, which is the right way of making a copy of the cell, it now reads A, B, C, D, F, E, G. All right? It's backwards. And then you try and mate that group with this group, and you see the poor old chromosome desperately trying to turn around, and if it can't match up the order, it simply fails. So there's heaps and heaps and heaps of mechanisms which would stop us trying to do that. You know, it's just a real problem in the research of people who are trying to cause that sort of artificial hybridization.